Should the Vikings regret not signing Jim Harbaugh as their head coach back in 2022? The short answer is yes. I felt that way at the time. I still feel that way right now. It'd be one thing if, let's say, the Vikings had hired Mike McDaniel, who I talked about earlier this week, the progression that he has made in his second year as head coach of the Dolphins. Dude, give Mike McDaniel these weapons that the Vikings have: Jefferson, Addison, Kirk Cousins, TJ Hawkinson. This offense would go nuts. It'd be one thing if Mike McDaniel was the head coach of the Vikings. You could look back and say, man, you remember that Jim Harbaugh situation? Be like, yeah, that was crazy, right? But with the head coach that we have, KOC, it becomes even more of a glaring issue to say, man, what could have been? The Vikings, they fumbled the bag 3 times in that whole saga with Jim Harbaugh. And just to go back, Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah, newly hired GM. First order of business, you got to hire a head coach. And while interviewing guys like Raheem Morris and Patrick Graham and KOC, you also throw a feeler out there to Jim Harbaugh, in which case Harbaugh gets back to you and says, yep, I'm interested. Let's do this. And John Bacon, who's a New York Times best-selling writer, he's a journalist and author, covers Michigan football, at the time tweeted this out. Harbaugh watch day 31. Here goes. Harbaugh meets with Minnesota GM and owners today. It is not a done deal. Harbaugh has to answer questions and criticisms, fair and not. GM has to convince owners. Owners can do whatever they like and often do. If offered, Harbaugh will accept. Harbaugh to Minnesota, 80-20. And we all know what happened afterward. He ended up going back to Michigan without an offer from the Vikings, and the rest is history. KOC is the next head coach of the Vikings. 3 points here that John Bacon noted. The first that I want to highlight is the last point that he made, saying that if offered the job, Jim Harbaugh will accept. You had this man in the building. I'm guessing he took a private jet to TCO Performance Center. And I get it. In life, I understand we want everything to be fair and balanced. No short corners taken. However, sometimes there are exceptions to the rule. Example, if you're interviewing for a head coaching position and you come across a guy that of the caliber of Jim Harbaugh, where everything he touches when it comes to football turns to gold at Stanford, with the 49ers, with Michigan. That's it. However, the other 2 points made by Bacon is that they wanted to make it a bureaucratic red tape process. It is not a done deal. Jim Harbaugh has to answer questions and criticisms, fair and not, and GM has to convince owners. Essentially, you are the equal, Jim Harbaugh, to Patrick Graham and Raheem Morris and KOC, which is absolutely ridiculous. Imagine if you're a first-time director and you have auditions scheduled with first-time actors, never had any major roles, but in the middle of that process, you throw out a feeler to Willem Dafoe. I think they're the equivalent of one another. Willem Dafoe and Jim Harbaugh. Jim Harbaugh never won a championship at the college level or in the pros. However, he's gotten really, really close. TBD in the upcoming national championship game against Washington. Willem Dafoe, one of the greatest actors of my lifetime, never won an Oscar. Imagine Willem Dafoe gets back to you and says, yeah, we'll talk. At that moment, that's it. But imagine you meet with him and you say, well, you need to audition and prove to me why you deserve to be in my film like everyone else. Bro, it's Willem Dafoe. It's Jim Harbaugh. What is wrong with you? The champagne has to be ready to pop by the time that he meets with you. And instead, you were more interested in putting together a Vikings utopia instead of putting together a Vikings football team. Here's where the Vikings screwed up in this process. 3 times. The first being not hiring him at all, which was stupid. The second being making him the equal to everybody else when Jim Harbaugh is so much better than everybody else that you were interviewing. The third being is that knowing that information, if you knew at the time before you scheduled to meet with him, you knew that you wanted to go through this long process and ask him all these questions and essentially put him through an interrogation process, a guy of his caliber, you should have never scheduled anything with him in the first place. You should have never contacted him. But you did. And Jim Harbaugh took time out of his day on National Signing Day to say, hey, I'm here. I'm ready. Where do I sign? When do I start? Let's get to work. And the Vikings, they just responded with, you know what? Well, we thought about it and we appreciate your time, but we don't think you quite mesh with our hashtag culture. So thank you, but no thanks. And it's even crazier just looking in hindsight, looking back to say, what if they had have hired Jim Harbaugh? I have no doubt, because the man has had instant success everywhere he's gone, that the Vikings, I believe, would be in a much better position now compared to where they are now under head coach Kevin O'Connell, because he has a healthy balance. Is he a bit of a whack job? Sure. But you know what? He holds players accountable while at the same time being a player's coach. There's a fine balance. And the Vikings would be competitive. We wouldn't have all these question marks surrounding the team and, dare I say, calling them soft in big games. We wouldn't have that with Harbaugh. This team wouldn't be soft. And I think I saw somewhere, I think from the Viking Age, suggesting that the Vikings should reach out to Harbaugh, part 2, to be their next head coach, because there's rumors swirling around after this national championship game, Harbaugh may entertain going back to the NFL again. And that's nice and all. First of all, they're not going to do it because I feel like Kwesi Adofo-Mensah and Kevin O'Connell, they're a package deal. But even if they wanted to, say that the Wolf brothers gave the okay to say, go ahead, fire KOC and interview/hire Jim Harbaugh. It's never going to happen. Why? Because you burnt that bridge with a coach of his caliber. It's never going to happen. And man, I tell you what, if he does go back to the league, if he comes back to the NFL and he's successful, it's going to look even more damning to the Minnesota Vikings. So yeah, they should absolutely regret not hiring Jim Harbaugh.